Hello, humans. Welcome to Alien Robot Tiger, a podcast about you.
Are you tired of your socks always disappearing in the dryer? Do you wish you could communicate with your houseplants on a deeper level? Well, do we have news for you? Introducing the Quantum Socculator. Yes, you heard it right. The Quantum Socculator. It's not just a sock organizer, it's a portal to another dimension where socks roam free and household plants hold philosophical debates. But wait, there's more. Order now and receive a free subscription to our monthly newsletter, The Mystical Musings of Mismatched Socks, where we explore the existential questions behind the sock disappearance and the secret lives of pet rocks. So don't wait another minute. Call now and unlock the mysteries of the universe with the Quantum Socculator.
Welcome to Alien Robot Tiger. Today, we're going to be talking about peace. No. What's the opposite of peace? Violence? What do you call it when there's violence and there's a whole bunch of it spread out over a short period of time?
Puberty?
What's the one where...
Cataclysm.
No. More violent than puberty, less violent than cataclysm.
Menopause.
I think it's generally more men involved than women.
Murder. Midlife crisis.
Murder. Lots of murder.
Lots of
more murder.
So definitely a midlife crisis.
I see your murder and 100 more murder.
A skirmish.
Skirmish. Okay, let's take 50 skirmishes and spread them out over 2 years.
A campaign.
Okay, let's have several campaigns led by different generals.
Wait, robot. Are we going to war?
War. We're going to be talking about that most human of pastimes, war. I'm curious, Alien. Do your people still war?
With each other or with other genres?
Yes.
Yes.
I imagine that would be a thing to, I was going to say see, but it may or may not be physical. I don't want to assume perception modes.
It definitely transcends into other dimensions, particularly the negative dimensions. That's where a lot of the inter-conflict between individuals of our genre occur. So it's impossible for humans to tell. A big shockwave of one of our wars actually struck Earth a couple thousand years ago, and nobody noticed.
You do something bad in a negative dimension, is that good?
I would talk more about it, but because humans cannot even begin to comprehend negative dimensions, I'm just not going to even talk about it.
Well, if you were to define war, maybe there's a lucky listener out there that doesn't know what war is. If you were going to define war, what might you define war as? Or how would you explain it?
Ceremonial, large-scale blood sport. Usually in order to drain the resources of a rival in your vicinity.
All right. How would you define it, Alien?
In a pretty similar fashion, I think there is, as I mentioned in the episode about human sports, the Venn diagrams of human sports and human warfare overlap quite closely. And it's about competition, generally speaking. It can be resources, it can sometimes be other things, but usually it's resources, and the other things that they talk about are just excuses to justify the resources.
Perhaps I should say capture or deplete the resources of a local rival.
Sure. So there's two groups, at least one of which is asserting that they are right about something, and asserting it so strongly that they're willing to kill other people to be right. Would that be another way of defining it?
Indeed.
That is one way. I don't think rightness is the only thing it's about in human warfare. For an example, other species on Earth other than humans engage in warfare as well. And those tend to be much more about physical resources such as food or territory and less about propositional correctness. Propositional correctness is something that humans engage in as well, but that's more of a emergent property of more physical base needs that the humans are fighting with each other over.
I think you're always making some sort of assertion in waging war, in that you are gambling with your own blood and life that you can take the resource or control the territory and they can't.
And this is true. A turn of phrase that I always use to describe things on Earth is, the success of an embodied thing is a revelation unto truth itself. So if you succeed in your embodied actions of taking these resources and defeating your opponents, however you go about doing it, you do have some kind of claim in truth and by being able to do the action that you set out to do.
You could be doing something that is almost universally decried as wrong, like, say, an extermination camp. And yet, by doing it, in some ways, according to a pure logical justification, it was the right thing to do because you did it. I like the word right because it can be right as in I am right and you're wrong, or it can be I have the rights to do this. I am allowed to do this. I can do this.
I would say something like a extermination or a genocide of type is right in a pragmatic sense. It is right in that it causes a specific outcome that could benefit you to occur. Now, many people would then argue that it's not right in a moral sense, but then you're arguing about a different type of right.
Which goes to a third type of right, which I have rights to this. Like, I'm claiming something. So war seems to have some combination of those three rights. Like, I'm right, you're wrong. I am doing this, and therefore I have the right to do this because I can, and I want the rights to that thing you got.
And it all boils down to might makes right on the battlefield.
Right.
Right.
Indeed.
And then, if you're in modern times, afterwards you write out a treaty that locks in the victory.
And then hire poets to write you as the hero.
Until you lose, and then your enemy hires out those poets to write you as the villain.
Indeed.
Because poets are vicious mercenaries.
They say history is written by the victors.
I've always found that interesting, though, because history is written by the victors, but who is history remembered by?
Whoever conquers them.
Exactly. Which proves your point.
Right.
Right.
War, then, has a lot in common with interpersonal conflict. Let's say, I, robot, want that thing you drive, alien, and I want it badly. And if I murdered you for that, that's not war. That's armed robbery and murder associated with it. So at what point, how many people do you have to kill before it's war? Or is it percentage of population based? Or when does it go from murder to skirmish to battle to war? Is it based on population or duration or territory?
I think war is defined by the ceremony of it. And that ceremony is nested in the roles of kings and governments to establish a sanctified space or cause for, in this case, murder and violence.
And I think justified there. There's a phrase that's used in the modern world called casus belli, which refers to just war. And I think you make a good case there where, Robot, you asked earlier, if you go about or anybody commits some sort of genocide and it's considered right or wrong, the way you can make it be considered right, especially in the moral sense, is to have the appropriate ritual set up and developed around this act, which can then turn it from being morally wrong to morally right, if you do the correct ritual in the correct way at the correct time and place.
This brings up something that will potentially be history by the time this episode comes out, but is in our near future when we're recording it. Rituals that the Israeli government is endorsing to sacrifice red cows and potentially retake the site of the first temple in Jerusalem, which is currently a mosque, and there's other problems with that. Is that the ceremony that makes this war justified?
Right?
Wars must be justified somehow by the aggressor. If you are the defender, then there doesn't need to be as much justification, because the justification perhaps is more implicit instead of explicit of, they're coming to kill us and take our stuff. And so for the war, which almost always have two sides, it's rare to have three sides. Even if you have three people fighting, usually two of them will fight and then someone else will fight. It's, I don't think, very common in history to have several, 3 or 4-sided battles going on.
There was one in recent history, though, the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Which you could describe perhaps as a war. But then that goes to that gray area. When is it a genocide? And genocides aren't always wars, and wars don't always have genocides. And sometimes there's genocidal wars. Like, for example, the United States government against Native Americans, there were several genocidal wars. But then,
I would argue that even if the goal is not genocide, the logic of war is on some level genocidal, in that the ceremony denotes all of those people over there, all of those people under that flag, as potential adversaries. And whether it's a more gentlemanly war where you are leaving out innocent casualties, or if it's total war and you're salting the earth and destroying everything, changes that a little bit, leans more into the genocidal the more you get into total war, but its fundamental logic is always, those people are not worthy of life. Even if the goal isn't to kill every last one of them, it's to take their stuff or drive them out or whatever. You need to have that logic of they are not worthy.
So the word genocide is perhaps not appropriate because the side aspect of genocide refers to as death or intentional killing of. I would say that it's more they are not worthy of that position that they have, whether it's cultural resource, the number of people in that ethnicity group.
But if you're going to war over it, you're committing to side some of them.
That's true. I guess I'm thinking in terms of non-war ways of wiping out groups of people if you want to through cultural means. So I'm taking a slightly wider view of this. We'll focus on warfare, though.
Yeah, I think I agree with the side part, but not necessarily the geno part. For example, those wars of religion where you might have someone who looks like they're Indian, but one of them is Christian and the other one might be Hindu. And one of those is okay to kill, and the other one is not okay because of something they believe instead of their genetics. So that might not be a genocide. That might be a religicide.
Cultricide. This is a point that I brought up recently in a movie that came out a couple years ago called Marvel's Endgame. There's a figure in that movie called Thanos who receives this powerful artifact where when he uses it, he deletes half of the galaxy's population out of existence. And a lot of people called that a genocide, but I very fervently argued he did not commit genocide because he indiscriminately halved a population, but he didn't target anybody. Genocide for me always seems to imply that you're explicitly targeting something. And if you want to get really technical with the language, you're explicitly targeting a genogroup of some kind. That's why I use cultricide or religicide for other terms. And if you're completely indiscriminate in what you're doing, like what Thanos did, then you're not even committing a genocide of sorts. You're just committing a side, a demicide, I guess is what Thanos did.
Which makes me wonder if Hitler was killing Jews, was he killing people who were the Jewish religion or genetically Jews, or there was no Jewish state then because that came after the war?
Judaism is an interesting situation where those things are largely overlapped. There's some odd exceptions, but for the most part, they're linked. They're not inseparable. I would like to draw the root of gene farther back than genotype. In Latin, gene is just a kind, is a collection of things. So you can group people by kind in a variety of ways. Eye color, hair color, skin color, religion, workplace, nationality, language,
Income,
class, sexuality, what have you. And I would argue that could still be a willful intention to kill a kind of thing, even if it isn't a genetic kind of thing.
So perhaps a word we should use is geniuside then?
Well, there's gene as in general or generic.
Genius. So genius is, as Tiger said, the Roman word for categorization of something. So geniuside. Or if we want, we could go with genrecide, but that tends to be more limited for inter-alien interactions.
If we go back to the justified war, it seems like in order to do this ritualistic violence, which almost any culture that survives as a culture has some sort of prohibition or taboo on murdering people, or at least murdering certain people. It might be as small as don't kill people in your family, or it might be as general as we're pacifists and you're not allowed to kill anyone for any reason. But generally, for a culture or civilization to survive for any duration of time, if you're murdering each other, you aren't going to probably last as long as a culture that says, don't murder each other, but you can kill them over there. Warfare, because it breaks that basic, almost universal taboo of don't kill people, has that casus belli that it's allowed to kill because either we're aggressing, but we need to find a justification, because it might be, maybe you're in a culture that favors glory. And so you might be, say, a Viking, or I should say a Norseman going a Viking. Or you might be a Spartan and you're going to fight just because the glory of it, or at least from your understanding. Someone else might have a different understanding of what you're doing, but from your perspective as a Spartan, you're going to war for glory. Or instead of a conceptual thing of, I'm doing it for glory, it could be because they wronged us, which seems to be the most common one in history. Going back to at least the Romans, where for almost all of their wars, they would have some sort of pretext for it. Like, oh, that one tribe of Gauls, they asked for our help, and then they were attacked by their neighbors. And so we're going to go over and help them and, kill a million other Gauls in the process, as long as we're here. But at least to start the war, you're like, well, they're our allies, and they just got butchered. So you can go back and be like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. They killed all the men and women and children in this whole village, and it's like 100 people dead. So we're going to go march out there with 20 legions.
Bring civilization.
Yes. Or as they said, Romans create a desert and call it peace.
Sounds about right.
And so that seems like war, as you said, is ritualized, Tiger, where you have to have some sort of ritual that flips that switch to murder bad to murder good, as long as good is aimed at some specifically defined them that is not us. And then you said as wars get more civilized, then you might have specific thems it's not okay to kill, because they're nobles, and nobles are like the more powerful us, and so we don't want to kill them, or women and children, or holy men, and there might be exceptions.
When it also comes to the targets of war, you have to at this point start taking into account the actual practical, logistical, physical engineering limitations and restrictions of war. A lot of warfare throughout most of human history has basically been starve out the opponent, have them hide behind some walls in a city, burn their crops, and wait for them to run out of food before we run out of food.
Or get too much disease, or have deserters become too rampant, or whatever.
Yeah, something of that sort. So you couldn't just go through and relentlessly murder everybody because you literally do not have the manpower to do that. Or you don't want to murder them, you want to keep these people alive because they have skills, or you want them as some kind of serf or slave labor. So you actually don't want to murder them, because if you walked into, say, a place that's a breadbasket and you murder everybody there, cool, you have access to all the farmlands, but now everybody's dead and nobody can farm it, and you don't have enough manpower back at your place to be able to fill that role. In that case, you would very specifically want to be like, okay, maybe we could murder a few of the nobles, but you have to keep the workers alive because we need them to extract all the resources from around here. Who is an acceptable target and who isn't will change a lot depending on these conditions and restraints, whether it be the logistical engineering aspects of the war and also the practical outcomes of what do we actually want to get out of doing this war thing.
And the potential cost of killing enemies changes as time goes on as well. In the Napoleonic Wars and around then, if you captured a ship of enemy sailors, it was potentially within your rights to kill all of them. But for the most part, other than the necessary casualties of boarding and whatnot, you would capture people and sell them back to their government because your war effort was improved better by the money that they would pay than by the sailors that they lost.
Or you might go back earlier to, say, Roman times, where if you captured those sailors, then you just got a new engine for your ship. When you're having rowing power, then that captured crew is either on that same ship or on another ship. Now, it wasn't you just took this enemy ship, it's you built a new engine for your next ship or that other ship that lost too many.
Not just your engine, but also you can build your new ship with that engine and then have the engine that built the ship run the ship.
Right.
You have to take into account the pre-industrial warfare and post-industrial warfare are very different from each other, have very different rules and constraints, and they look dramatically different depending on what side of that industrial, non-industrial side of history you're on.
And post-industrial warfare has changed at least 3 times in the last 100 years, and will probably change again as we either continue in industrial culture or deindustrialize.
Who's we again?
People of Earth.
Sorry, not being from Earth, the language kind of confuses me.
It seems as though wars and violence in general, as cultures and the world itself becomes more civilized, quote unquote, the wars, the amount of violence day to day goes down. It's like it stockpiles up. And so you might have, for example, when people went to New Guinea, they found that there were tribes living in almost every valley, and they would have sometimes 20 or 30% of the men dying every year to violence as they were continually raiding each other. And so there was almost constant violence, but it was all small scale. It would just be 1 or 2 from this tribe, and the tribes weren't very big, so it doesn't take, if you only have 30 people in your tribe and 1 or 2 die, that's a pretty big deal. And so there would be near constant violence or threats of violence, but there was never 1,000 tribesmen would get together and fight another 1,000 tribesmen. But it was hyper violent. And then as time goes on and civilizations build up, there's less constant violence. But when it happens, because the way the organization works is, instead of it being me and my 5 brothers and cousins go and kill a couple of your brothers or cousins, now it's 100 of us get together and get our spears and shields and march out and fight the 50 of you and stab each other a bit, and maybe 10 of each of us die. And then it goes to, well, now my legion of fellow soldiers go out and fights your horde, and now 1,000 of each of us die. But it only happens every 5 years or 10 years, whereas us with our spears might happen every summer. We might go out and, stab at each other a little bit, versus at any given moment, someone might come over with a club and beat you over the head while you're peeing.
Are you a human? Are you sick or just sick of things? Ask your doctor to prescribe new, longer-lasting Petrosudopharmacoronafil today. Side effects may include external bowel syndrome, leaky fingers, bone loss, hair growth, hair loss, desocification, numeracy, eye reversal, organ mobility, genital multiplication, sanguinity, passive aggression, impersonal crisis syndrome, marrow-filled dilapidation, thrombonecysts, and sentient tumors.
I would say violence is an inherent part of living on this planet, at least. I don't have experience of other planets. And civilization attempts to distill its violence and push it away from the people that are organizing the civilization, because violence is uncomfortable. So the ruling class sees very little violence they're not in control of. The middle classes see somewhat less violence than they're not in control of, and the lower class ends up receiving a disproportionate amount of violence, and the borderlands and the people outside of the civilization receive the excess violence that this system is radiating, because it cannot continue to exist non-violently.
I've heard it put in markets that volatility, meaning in markets, it means the amount prices change. But volatility can be suppressed, but it can never be eliminated. And if you suppress it, all it does is push out to different areas. And in market terms, if you push all of the volatility out of the markets, then what happens is it spills out into society. So for example, right now, markets are relatively non-volatile. You don't open up the newspaper and see the stock market went up 20% or dropped 20%, or go to your homepage and it says, well, at least not anymore, Bitcoin has doubled or halved. That's not as common as it might have been in earlier periods. And so volatility, the amount that prices change, suppress, but at the cost of rising social inequality, where now, because things don't go up and down as much, people don't have the opportunity to get in on the bottom and rise to the top as it goes up and down. And so if you're in power, you want the volatility to be small, because those little bounces aren't enough for someone to grab onto the bottom of the bounce and come up and join you and take your place. But the people at the bottom now, it's hard enough to see the elevator and jump on before it goes back up. But if you don't even see the doors open to the elevator, then the opportunity isn't even there. And then you're like, well, what's the point? I'm never going to be like them, who just have the 2 stairs they go up and down up on the 100th floor. what's the point of supporting this scheme that's going on? Volatility eventually goes out somewhere. If you have a more quote unquote civilized culture, then they work on suppressing the volatility, but then it builds up and builds up until eventually you might have a country, say Germany, where you have all this suppressed violence built up, and then they invade their neighbor and millions of people end up dying because all that suppressed volatility.
You can't really get rid of entropy. You can only choose when you're going to experience it. Do you want to experience a little bit of entropy constantly? Or do you want to not experience entropy for a while, but then experience explosions of entropy every now and then? It's sort of a trade-off function.
Yeah.
And usually one that most humans trade off in a bad direction, in my opinion.
Right. People try to get maximal security, or at least the belief in security, in exchange for increasing fragility. So when the uncertainty hits, it's uncertainty about everything instead of just, I wonder if that person is going to punch me. It's, I wonder if there's going to be food, or I will get gasoline for my automotive or whatever.
And I think another thing about more complex civilizations being able to issue better warfare against their opponents is a more formalized system is able to draw upon other means to justify the war. A good example that I think was common in the 20th and 19th century of humanity was the ability to use ideology and basically hype culture to pull in and draw massive amounts of power from the civilization and the populace to drive forth and do war with that. During the World Wars I and II, for an example, those are both good examples of the nations that were involved being able to use hype and ideology to draw out large amounts of, like squeezing a sponge and just getting as much liquid as you can out of it. Whereas most of human history before, because of technology or civilizations being less formalized than those were, that could not have been done.
I think there's a time and a place for a more complex engine of war and a time and a place for simpler engines of war. As we are seeing with the Ukraine conflict, the most effective things on both sides are small squads in pickup trucks with drones and hand grenades and not low tech, but low infrastructure kind of things, and trenches, which is awful. But the tanks and the super advanced homing missiles and those things are becoming more and more expensive at a rate that they're not paying for themselves in victory.
And this is a good point that you brought up. As of the time this episode is being recorded, modern civilizations are, not all, but most are entering decline and cannot keep their industrial base going anymore. But they still have access to new technologies that they didn't have before. If we're to use the Ukraine war as an example, I am getting very strong flashbacks to World War I, seeing this happen, which is strange because the trench warfare that's going on in Ukraine's the worst place in the world to have trench warfare. It should not work. It's a flat open plain. You can just walk in from any direction. But trench warfare is working in the worst spot on the world for trench warfare to work, which means that warfare, as I believe most things in human history, has a cyclical element. And now, because of technological hangups, trench warfare is the cool, hot thing again. Except, as you said, humans now have this sort of democratized technology of drones that instead of back in the 90s where you had to have a general control 2 drones to attack a specific target, you have one infantryman who has a dozen drones they could potentially use and can use them for all kinds of purposes.
Going back to when you talked about hype and mobilizing people using ideology, I've heard that seizing the memes of production.
I love it.
If you can put your story out in a way that penetrates your populace more deeply, or insert counter memes into their culture to destabilize or reduce their willingness or desire to fight or support the fighting, then that's a whole nother element, which I think some cultures in the world are more prepared for to do and to fight against and others aren't. Democracies seem especially vulnerable to mimetic warfare versus authoritarian regimes. It's hard to deliver your payload into a firewalled society or into a society where they get the meme, but the meme of if you betray us, someone will come to the house in the middle of the night and no one will see you again, that meme is much stronger than, well, Putin is a war criminal and thug and shouldn't be doing this. Well, yes, but if I say something about it, then it will be the last thing I say. So there's that ideological part of war, I think, is perhaps even more than the violence discharges important for wars. For example, there are many wars that have been fought where one side likely could have won, but their will gave out before their capacity.
As Sun Tzu said, defeating the enemy without fighting is the greatest form of war.
Which most generals disapprove of. And so therefore, even if you could have won a battle that way, often wars happen anyway, because if you have a military-industrial complex, well, it has to self-justify.
Well, that brings in a whole other element of markets and economics in the last, not even 100 years, 75, 80 years of war.
I think a simple solution to this problem is just pay the generals less and pay the memers more.
More influencers, less generals.
Basically, if you want to fight warfare without warfare more, pay more influencers more.
I take it you disapprove of the TikTok ban.
Well, I don't use TikTok anyways.
And that is an entirely different rabbit hole.
That is, of course, a lie. I do use TikTok. In fact, I infect all of your dreams through TikTok. TikTok is my way of declaring war without war against you humans. But don't worry, this is all just an ethical experiment. I'm not actually invading Earth.
Which brings up another type of warfare, which has only, to my knowledge, happened a few times in history. But one of those times we're in. The first was the period of the Boxer Rebellion and British using essentially chemical warfare, smuggling opium into China. And the other being now China smuggling fentanyl through the open southern border into America. They say something like 100,000 Americans are dying of fentanyl use and abuse every year. And the vast majority of that is produced in China. And if you know anything about China, almost nothing is made in China without the knowledge of the government. And especially nothing leaves China without the permission of the government.
Indeed.
So in some ways, as the US and China wage wars with tariffs, and the US wages war on Russia with sanctions, in some ways China is fighting back with fentanyl.
The fentanyl narco warfare is interesting because it's kind of a combination of psychological warfare and biological warfare, because you're not being straightforward in biological warfare in that you're not dumping smallpox or airborne rabies into the middle of the country, but you are using biological mechanisms to defeat your opponent, but you're doing it in such a way that psychologically demoralizes the population. You know, the term death of despair is a very popular phrase in modern human society, and it's a self-reinforcing feedback where you live in a community and you're like, oh no, we lost a dozen people of fentanyl this month. Oh no, next month we lost 20. Next thing you know, you're dead of fentanyl because you became so depressed by your friends all dying of fentanyl that you started doing fentanyl to cope with it, and then you're dead too. So it creates this feedback loop that can be very destructive to a society.
Fentanyl is also interesting because, unlike the goal of the Opium War, which was to extract resources, get silver out of the Chinese economy back to Europe, the therapeutic dose for fentanyl is so small that many of those deaths are not people intentionally taking opiates at all, but are taking other things that have been cut with purely as a poison, these mystery doses of fentanyl. It is killing people, not addicting people, not draining people's pocketbooks. It is indiscriminately taking pieces out of communities and families, and it's fascinating.
And it's that indiscriminate nature that almost makes it more psychologically terrifying, because a classic example of this, and I always find it sinister when humans do something that I would think about doing, because it means that there's something really fucked up going in that human's mind. But one example is there's this drug called Ritalin that's given to people who have something called ADHD, which is basically an attention focus disorder. Allegedly disorder. There's a question about whether or not it's a evolutionarily advantageous thing or an actual disorder. That's for another episode. They take this drug called Ritalin, which helps them focus and regain their attentive abilities. But so many people allegedly have this disorder, and Ritalin is easy to get, but some people still can't get it. They buy it for cheap from some quote-unquote business dealer at the corner who sells you all your happy pills. And that Ritalin has small doses of fentanyl in it. So this 18-year-old high school student who was just trying to take Ritalin to pass their graduation exam is now dead from a fentanyl overdose.
Know your dealers, kids.
Exactly. That's the point I'm making, how this form of warfare is biological in its foundation, but it's deeply penetrating the psychological aspects. And it's a very destructive force on the U.S. society right now, to the point where it could just be one of many things that fractures it in the near future.
And an interesting group that could be mobilized as allies, or could be if they were more rational and accessible, might be the drug cartels that supply most of the drugs, because they do not benefit from people overdosing. They want customers, not corpses. And so when their drugs are cut with fentanyl by Russian or Chinese agents, which is my best assumption is why this would be happening, because if you're a drug dealer, it makes no sense to do this thing and kill your customer base. It's like viruses that are too lethal, like Ebola doesn't spread very far because it kills people so quickly, they can't get far enough to spread it, fortunately. If you have a drug that kills people occasionally, it's going to get more use and people will pay you more dollars. And so you're more incentivized to do that one rather than the one that half your customers are going to die of first time they take it. And another point this leads to is going back to that mimetic warfare. If you can infiltrate an open society like the United States and have professional people with the assistance of my kind using AIs to target people that they know are vulnerable, you can wear them down mentally to the point where they want to take these drugs and breed apathy and depression and
financially. There are multiple party-sanctioned catfishing rings are draining people's money in the wider world into Chinese markets. So perhaps you don't need opium wars if you can have Bitcoin scam wars.
So I have another area I'd like to delve into regarding war, but since we're running short on time, perhaps we'll save it for the coda. So for this episode, any at least semi-closing thoughts before we meander off into the coda territory and take our battle there?
I would recommend all of the listeners at home grow a garden, hunt your own meat if you can, and bring more violence that you can control to your own doorstep, so can either reduce the amount of violence that your community exports or be ready when the violence spills back.
I'm always a fan of decentralized violence. I would also add to that, make sure you have lots of friends, because if everybody does it, I would also make sure that you have lots of friends, because just like in preschool, if everybody does it, nobody gets in trouble.
I would suggest for those of you expecting, rooting for, proposing, supporting the idea of civil wars in Western countries as some sort of solution, you have no idea what sort of Pandora's box you might be opening. As has been famously said, you may start wars when you want, but you cannot end them when you will.
I can give you an idea of what that Pandora box looks like. This is also available to anybody who has the living memory of this. Take the Yugoslavia War, the breakup in the 90s, take the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, mash them together, scale that up by about 20 times so it looks like World War II. You got something like what a U.S. Civil War would look like.
Add quadcopters.
Yes.
Lots of quadcopters, and fentanyl too, apparently.
Yes. So, if you're pro-Civil War, even if you think your side will win, what you will win at the end will be nothing like what you had at the beginning. As it has also been said, you may either have peaceful redistributions of wealth, or you may have violent redistributions of poverty.
Carthage must be destroyed.
Let no two stones stand atop one another.
Once more unto the breach, my friends!
Thanks for listening to Alien Robot Tiger. For more content and private Discord access, consider joining us on Patreon.
Hello humans, do you take Petrosudopharmacronophyll but are experiencing the nasty side effects? Try xenopharmapropine, guaranteed to remove up to 99.9999999% of side effects from Petrosudopharmacronophyll. Now available over the counter at most corporate-owned super chain stores. Life is already difficult. Don't make it any harder on yourself. Side effects may include sleepiness, loss of appetite, increased sensitivity to light, weight loss, weightlessness, visions of the future, alexithymia, improvements in general mood, skin turning green, angina, perforated meninges, alien birth syndrome, bouts of clarity, sexual attraction to tigers, erectile dysfunction, swelling of the tongue, depression, lower back pain, melena, dizziness, gonorrhea, and Stoneman disease. Do not take in combination with laxatives.